Let's go ahead and bring in our special guest. His name is Mosaab. He is a journalist, and he is going to break down what is happening in Sudan. Let's go ahead and bring him in. What's going on, Mosaab?
Hey, Sabrina. How are you doing? Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining. This has probably been one of the most requested topics from viewers that watch the show. They do want someone to explain what exactly is happening in Sudan and if the U.S. is involved. So I want to start with this article here. For those who are not aware, this was reported recently that there was blood visible from space in Sudan. It says it shows evidence of the Darfur genocide. Now, I know, Mosaab, you don't want to get too much into this. But it does point back to the genocide that is happening in Sudan. If you could please, first and foremost, explain to us, how did all of this begin?
So thank you for having me on, Sabrina. This basically started decades ago. I mean, the Sudan government for a long time, if you go back to the 70s, it was, it was kind of coerced into joining the U.S. policy in the region. So it was used kind of as a weapon against Libya, against Chad, against Ethiopia, all at the time who had pretty much, sovereign governments. They had their own internal problems. But essentially, Sudan was brought into that neoliberal fold. The government kind of did a U-turn in the 90s, and they, claimed sovereignty, and they didn't want to follow the U.S. policy anymore, but they went in a very extreme direction of kind of, supporting militant Islamist groups and, hosting bin Laden and all that kind of stuff. And that got them on the radar for regime change. In the late 90s, the late Dick Cheney and his friends, the neocons, they put Sudan on the list of, 7 countries to be toppled in 5 years. So it was on that list along with Iran and Syria and Libya and Iraq. But they kind of compromised with the U.S. and they let South Sudan separate to become its own country. So after that, then, the Arab Spring came along. Bashir got pretty shook by it. And he decided to go fully into the fold of the Gulf Arab countries, and kind of under the fold of the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Egypt. The main thing that brings these countries together is that these are the countries that are allies of the US. And they're the ones that have a good relationship with Israel. They might not, outright have a lot of diplomatic relationships with Israel and everything, but that changed in 2020 with the Abraham Accords. But the struggle inside of Sudan has always been the problem of a fascist government in Khartoum. In Khartoum, the capital, for the last 40 plus years, there's been a fascist government, far right extremist, policies. They claim sovereignty, but they work with the World Bank and put heavy austerity measures, privatizing large sectors of the economy. So they've been going along with that program, but kind of walking that step until 2014. That's when they joined it fully into that fold of the Gulf Arab countries. Then in 2019, a popular movement sparked and, removed Bashir. Once Bashir was out of the picture, the strong man who was kind of towing that line between the East and the West and everything, then it became kind of an open playing field for a lot of intelligence. The U.S. intelligence, Israeli intelligence, the UAE, Turkey, people because of the strategic location of Sudan and the amount of resources. Sudan geographically is a place that connects North Africa with the Horn of Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, and the Sahel region. If you look at Sudan and its geography, it connects all of these regions together. So historically, it was even like a super highway of civilizations and of movement and of trade and stuff like that. And that's why it's always been on the US's radar as far as a place that has to be put, quote unquote, under control. This pressure, like neo-colonial pressure, led to the powers inside of Sudan, specifically the army and the RSF, vying for power, and not just political power, but economic power as well. And this is where countries like the UAE fully adopted the RSF. Now, those of you, your audience who are old enough, probably remember in the 2000s, the Save Darfur movement, you know, the genocide in Darfur. And people usually don't follow up to see, you know, what happened to that campaign, like what happened to that genocide. The genociders won. The Janjaweed militia actually was legitimized and became the RSF that we know today. And the European Union funneled money to them so that they can protect the borders and quell migration. You know, the UAE and Saudi Arabia recruited them so that they fight the Houthis, Ansar Allah, in Yemen. You know, so the RSF slowly became a country within a country. So they committed genocide in the 2000s. And then when Bashir was removed, they overthrew another civilian government. And then it became the question of, well, how can you have two armies in one country? You know, you can't have the official army, SAF, and you can't have the RSF side by side. There has to be a security structure, security sector reform. And that's where basically the old guard that were in SAF and the new guard that's in the RSF bumped heads because none of them want to give up power. None of them want to give up the resources, the vast gold mines, the livestock, you know, all of the political power that comes along with that. You know, the Red Sea, you know, so many different countries want ports on the Red Sea. That's also a part of it. Food security for the Middle East, you know, Sudan has vast agricultural projects. But so all of these things kind of created the perfect storm. But it's still, I mean, you see in 2023 and 2024, Netanyahu brought out to the UN General Assembly a map that had the new Middle East. And it basically included the Gulf countries, Egypt, and Sudan. You know, so, you know, there was some criticisms in the beginning of the war. You know, people were like, you know, don't make everything about Israel. Well, you know, Sudan got pushed into this new Middle East map. And apparently all of the policies that were pushed on it were in lockstep with US and Israel policy. And this just basically broke the country because they propped up these criminal entities like the RSF and Bashir's party, the NCP, within, you know, controlling SAF. And, you know, one of the goals of this war is to kill any kind of sovereign citizen movement to move towards democracy and let go of these, you know, monopolies, these military monopolies on the Sudanese economy. There are other issues as well. You know, the Bashir regime for 40 years has been pushing an Islamo-Arab centric policy and trying to make Sudan into one homogeneous, you know, identity of being Arabs and being Muslim. And this also made non-Arabs within Sudan, indigenous groups, feel like they're second-class citizens. That's what led to the separation of South Sudan. It led to genocides in South Sudan and Darfur and the Nuba Mountains. So we have a lot of complex problems that were never solved, and everything was just pushed under the rug. And this is what led right now. But the genocide that's going on right now in Al-Fashir is kind of a continuation of a long, you know, track record of this central government basically trying to quell its citizens and coerce them.
So once again, Israel is involved. Skylar brings up a good point here. So they want Sudan as part of the new Middle East because Sudan has all the gold and farmland.
That's part of it, yes. But more importantly, so that Sudan doesn't become part of a resistant axis to US and Israel policy. You know, Sudan is a country of 40 million people. You know, between it and Israel, there's only one country geographically, and that's Egypt. So the proximity, also the geographic proximity, makes it so where that they want to make sure Sudan kind of is kept in check. And of course, part of it is also they don't want Sudan to be a solid ally with Russia or China or any one of the other competing countries with the West. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple of reasons. The resources is part of it. And part of it is kind of geostrategic as well.
So we cannot stress this enough that once again, we have another conflict that Israel is a part of. I want to get your opinion about this, Mosaab. I have seen videos of people fleeing Sudan. When people are fleeing Sudan right now, those who are able to get out, where are they going?
So that's one of the biggest, the big tragedy right now is the magnitude of the war itself. Try to think about this. 12 million people displaced. Million. 12 million people being displaced. Basically, the Sudanese, they went in all different directions. There's 1.5 million that went to Egypt. There's another 1.5 million that went to Chad. 1.2 million went to South Sudan. I know family members people who went to Saudi Arabia. Some people went to Kenya. So really, when you look at the migration map as a result of this war, the Sudanese citizens had to disperse in all directions just to get away from all of the carnage.
So Egypt is taking in a lot of people then.
Absolutely.
Because my friend Nico House, he went to Egypt about a year ago, and he said he was surprised to see how many refugees were in Egypt. There were even Syrian refugees in Egypt. He had mentioned that. So it just seems like Egypt is taking in a lot of people. So this is really interesting. Thank you so much for this. The Oracle says, which group represents the indigenous Sudanese people?
I mean, they're all pretty much indigenous, but when we talk about non-indigenous, we don't want to make it seem as if these people are not Sudanese. They're Sudanese, but there are nomadic groups in Sudan. The nomadic groups go cross-border. So they would be in Sudan. They would go out, a lot of them are from Chad, Niger. But the agricultural communities, the indigenous communities like in Darfur and in the Nuba Mountains, in the far north of Sudan and the eastern part of Sudan, there's a lot of indigenous groups. The complication comes in when, the Bashir regime set up this kind of pro-Arabized Sudanese agenda, where the non-Arab indigenous groups are the ones that get the brunt of the war. They suffer the most. Since the days of South Sudan, you have people in Darfur, in the Nuba Mountains, in Blue Nile State, the southern and western and southeastern parts of Sudan have historically had, the worst experience when it comes to, the state violence and the genocide that's been perpetrated on them.
So how can this particular issue, is there a way to solve this genocide in Sudan? And why aren't more, and this is just a question I've been having for a long time. Why aren't other nations in that region pushing back against what is happening in Sudan?
Okay, so I mean, there's two folds to this. Like the solutions right now, there's kind of two tracks that are going. The U.S. is hosting, talks between the Egypt, the Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and they're talking strictly to the army and the RSF. There's some partial breakthrough. They're talking now about what the conditions are for the ceasefire, for like a humanitarian pause and then a ceasefire. So that's going along slowly. The other track is with the African Union, bringing together all of the political actors in Sudan to have a comprehensive dialogue. So that was supposed to kick off like a few months ago. It got delayed, but most likely if there's a breakthrough with this ceasefire, then there would be that bigger dialogue. And that's actually where the fundamental problems should be solved. So the issue of accountability is a huge one, where basically there has to be some framework of transitional justice. Just like a lot of African conflicts, you have to have truth and reconciliation. You have to have some sort of accountability for war crimes. You have to have some kind of rapprochement to the millions of IDPs and refugees right now return. You have to have some form of security sector reform where you have one national army instead of all of the armed groups that are in Sudan right now. So these are solutions, but they're slow solutions. But there's no way around it this time. There were wars, a lot of wars in Sudan that ended in negotiations, but they ended with power sharing rather than ending with some kind of fundamental dialogue to actually see how to move forward from there and how to avoid any of these wars in the future. So these things are in their infancy stages, unfortunately. But the reason the countries around Sudan are not able to stop this is because our neighbors are at war with each other as well. Unfortunately, Egypt and Ethiopia have a long-standing conflict, partially to do with the GERD dam, the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, and Egypt just outwardly hostile towards the dam, claiming that it'll affect the Nile waters. But it's more about regional influence and hegemony. You have, Khartoum has historically had a bad relationship with Chad. Of course, South Sudan separated, so there's some tension over there. A bad relationship with Libya. Eritrea and Ethiopia are not on the same page anymore, and they're kind of weighing how this war would affect them. And it really did. The war did affect all of the neighboring countries, from cross-border, troop movements to encroachment to taking in so many refugees. So all of the countries do actually want this war to stop, but they're not agreeing among each other. These are some of the problems that we have within the African Union of, conflicts within that. But there's been some positive steps. Like, for example, the BRICS included both Egypt and Ethiopia into the BRICS. They added them in 2023, I think, as a way to also say that, hey, we're all part of the same kind of global South. So why don't we stop the fighting and focus on development and partnerships and stuff like that? But again, it didn't really, show any concrete results yet. But the long arc of, this conflict will end with some kind of negotiated settlement. It's just a question of how long will that take.
Okay, here's a great question here from Ancient Crustacean. Where is the foreign intelligence in this war? Is there a local side versus a native side funded by foreigners, or are both sides funded by foreign nations? Or is it like Gaza and there isn't two sides, it's one side doing all the bad? That's a good question. Where's the funding coming from?
So who's at war right now? The Sudan Armed Forces against the RSF. The Sudan Armed Forces is primarily pushed by Egypt. Egypt has had since 2019, unfortunately, has had a pretty negative role in Sudan, trying to solidify military rule in Sudan, but also kind of, adopting SAF as their close ally. The bigger and more, dangerous threat is from the UAE. The UAE have adopted the RSF and have been funding it since way before the war. And through the war in Yemen, they've enabled the RSF to be kind of a country within a country. So unfortunately, there aren't any good actors leading the charge of the war, but these things change, and the war, the way it's going right now, I don't see any one of these polar, these leaderships as being someone, people to get behind. Now, that being said, there are a lot of people who picked up arms after 2023 to defend themselves. A lot of people who got into the under the SAF umbrella to defend their areas from the RSF. So these are people that are regular citizens and they just had to pick up arms. On the other side, the RSF, because they recruit on a tribal basis, if you're part of a tribe that's been targeted by the RSF, then your choices are very clear. Either you join the RSF or you get bulldozed by them. So they're like, all right, yeah.
What is the RSF?
It's the Rapid Support Forces. These are who used to be the Janjaweed in the 2000s. And then during the Bashir regime, they kind of gave them a proper name of the Rapid Support Forces. This is the main militia that's committing the atrocities right now in Darfur.
Okay. That's good to know, because I think that this is very different, because like when we talk about the genocide that's happening in Gaza, it's a little bit more straightforward, whereas with Sudan it's a little bit different because there's different groups, as you were referring to there. The Oracle says, so the Sudanese of Arab descent are the groups perpetuating the genocide with the assistance of the UAE and other US aligned actors, question mark.
Yeah, so the whole Arab thing in Sudan is pretty convoluted. You know what I mean? And the if you wanna look at it that way, both sides have an Arab supremacist undertone to all of their ideology, their movements, their alliances, and everything. So historically, it was both sides that committed the genocide in Darfur. It was both sides that committed the genocides in the Nuba Mountains and in the Blue Nile and these places. So it's actually the same Arab supremacy that got split into two right now. Now, that being said, a lot of non-Arab groups have joined the different sides. Some of them have joined the RSF and some of them have joined SAF. So it's not strictly right now along those ethnic lines. It's more about kind of, geography and alliances right now. But that is a common denominator between SAF and RSF. The policies that they followed and the genocides that were committed by both of them. 2023 is just them kind of disagreeing on who's going to take the bigger piece of the pie when it comes to Sudan.
Wow, this is insane. Why do you feel more corporate media outlets are not discussing this?
I think because of how complicated it is, number one. Number two, there's no clear, good guys and bad guys, the way the media usually likes to put it in a certain box where it's like, okay, who do we root for? And it just doesn't fit that module. But the other part of it, the corporate media doesn't cover it, because both sides, when you follow the money, it goes back to this US-Israel alliance in the region. Sudan's been pushed into this place and been shoved into the Middle East, even though when you look at Sudanese, you can't tell us apart from our African neighbors at all. I could be mistaken for an Ethiopian. Western Sudan might be mistaken for a Chadian. People in the Nuba Mountains might be mistaken for South Sudanese. Even people in the north are Nubians, and they belong to indigenous Black groups. So it's like the insistence of including Sudan into this Western Asia, so-called Middle East fold is kind of also one of the things that broke the country and led to kind of what we're seeing right now.
This is really interesting. Again, I just feel like still a lot of people don't know about this because it's been happening in the Congo as well. Margaret Kimberly came onto the show to discuss this a while back about genocide in the Congo. Israel had its hand in that as well with the mining, which I discussed before on the show. But I just think that, again, it's just either highly suppressed, but when it comes to corporate media, they're not really discussing this the way that they should. It's alarming, the video footage that I've seen. And I've mainly seen a lot of this stuff on Al Jazeera, or TRT World is where I've seen the video footage of what's happening in Sudan. But corporate media, for the most part, has been pretty silent as to what is going on there. And on that point, Shazmatica has a good point. Please tell us where we can get unfiltered news about Sudan. There are lots of videos surfacing without verification.
So my colleagues at IN Network, AYIN Network, that's one of the best sources for on-the-ground reporting, for video reports. You'll get a lot from it. Their Twitter is at AYIN Sudan. And it's basically, a repository going back to like 2013 and 2014. But, even now we have, they have a lot of testimony from the people who left Al Fashir and eyewitness testimonies to what they've seen and what they've been through.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mosaab. And where can people also follow your work? You also contribute to Black Agenda Report, correct?
Yes, I'm contributing. I started to contribute to Black Agenda Report. So I have some reports over there, and hopefully I'll have more coming up.
All right, Mosaab, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sabrina. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was Mosaab. So thankful that he could come on. I know you guys have been wanting to hear about this for quite some time. So, and I can bring him and others on later on as well, so that we can continue to follow what's happening in the Sudan. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.